Child sacrifice. So first of all, it's not like child sacrifice was something that everyone around Israel was constantly doing. Right? Child sacrifice was not like, you know, like the weekend activity for the neighboring nations. It was, as far as we can tell, an extreme measure taken only in desperation. Why would anyone sacrifice a child in the ancient world? The simple answer is because they thought it worked. And the most remarkable example of this comes obviously not from this story, but from a story about Israel's war against Moab. I seem to be using Moab for everything today. This battle between Israel and Moab, we actually have recorded both in the Bible and in a text from Moab itself, right? One of the only texts we have in the language of Moabite or from the nation of Moab is a royal statue describing this war against Israel. It's kind of amazing we have the evidence coming from both sides. And both versions tell basically the same story, which is Israel was winning the war, but in the end, Moab prevailed. And in the biblical version of the story, we are told that the turning point was that in a moment of almost defeat, the king of Moab sacrificed his eldest son. And the Bible tells us that it worked, right? Which is amazing, I think, to most of us. He took his firstborn son and offered him up on the wall as a burnt offering, and a great wrath came upon Israel, so they withdrew. That's how Israel lost, is because the king of Moab sacrificed his son. So whether moral or immoral may be the wrong categories, right? The issue with child sacrifice is, at least to some people in the biblical period and in the biblical context, it worked, right? It was recognized as efficacious. In this way, it's actually a lot like sorcery, another thing that's kind of forbidden in the Bible in multiple places. But there are also multiple stories in the Bible, one very famous one, at least, about people using sorcery to, discern the future, to speak to the dead, and it works. Right? It's not that it's forbidden because it works. So while there are indeed a lot of biblical statements against child sacrifice in both legal passages, right, laws saying don't do this, and prophetic texts that are, sort of accusing Israel of this sort of thing, right, there's a lot of biblical statements about child sacrifice. What they all seem to have in mind is that child sacrifice is an attempt to sway the deity, right, to change the course of events, to persuade God through this, unthinkable act, to do something differently. And in a sense, I wonder whether child sacrifice was forbidden, again, not because it was immoral, but because it worked. Yahweh, Israel's God, tends, as far as we can tell, not to like to relinquish control. And maybe it's that child sacrifice worked too well, right? If you sacrifice your kids, Yahweh has to respond, has to sort of accept that. And that's not okay. Alongside prohibitions, though, against child sacrifice, we also find the story of, in the book of Judges, of Jephthah and his daughter. Right, this is a story of Jephthah, who is a judge in Israel, who returns from victory in battle and vows to sacrifice the first thing that comes out of his house, which in our minds might seem like a crazy thing to do, because what else comes out of your house other than people? But we have to remember that in ancient Israel, actually, the ground floor of most houses were occupied by domestic animals. So probably assumed that one of his animals would come out of his house. But instead, out comes his daughter. And now he's vowed to sacrifice his daughter. Does Yahweh reject this because child sacrifice is forbidden? Not at all. In fact, he did to her as he had vowed. He goes through with it, Jephthah does, and sacrifices his daughter. And there's no punishment for him. There's no sense at all that it's wrong. That story in Judges is really a fable about not taking rash vows. But it's also a story in which somebody sacrifices their child and Yahweh seems to be perfectly okay with it, right? Which seems to sort of belie the notion that Yahweh rejects child sacrifice. And to come back to where I started, in our story, there is no rejection of child sacrifice either, right? Abraham assumes that Yahweh is serious, when he says, take your son and offer him as a burnt offering. Abraham assumes that that's something Yahweh actually wants. And Yahweh assumes that Abraham will take him seriously and actually do it. The story doesn't say, like at the end, no one shall, and that's why no one ever sacrifices a child to Yahweh, right? They knew how to write stories with morals. This one isn't one of them. In fact, the story kind of requires that child sacrifice be okay, or at least reasonable. Uh, I'm not saying that this story condones child sacrifice, just that it doesn't prohibit it either, right? This is my point at the beginning. It's kind of just not about that, even as it uses it as a plot device.